この空を貫いて地球を打った雷は
This podcast is a descendant of the protoculture. Welcome everyone to Super Audio Robo Podcast Z. I'm Ark, that's Nev. It's the show where we recommend you the finest of mecha content for your cultural and artistic development. Or should I say, Deculture.
Because we're talking about Macross today. I think an alternate, opening line would have also been something like, listen to our podcast.
Yeah, well, we'll save that for the one episode where that will be most appropriate. I think you know which one.
Oh, true, yes.
I got a lot of opening line ideas kind of just swimming around in my head, just waiting to get out. But yes, we're talking about Macross. This is our third of our four big overview episodes on very significant and important franchises that have left an indelible impact on the mecha genre. After talking about the origin of the super robot with Mazinger and then the start of the real robot craze with Gundam, it's where would you go from here? And it turns out there was another franchise that was I'd say, especially for me personally in some respects, a pretty big fucking deal. And it only came out just a few years after Gundam had first made itself known to the world.
Yeah.
Or at least made itself known to Japan, technically, because I forget, it wouldn't be until a couple decades later that Gundam would be a worldwide thing.
Yeah, it definitely took a while for Gundam. And this one, I feel, is, especially, compared to Gundam, it's not as big, but you can still feel its reach in the genre.
I definitely agree. When we get to it, you'll find that there's, quite a lot of things that it left a huge influence on, even though those elements seem very disparate from each other. But it was basically, Macross is ultimately, a big melting pot of ideas that have been, very important both, in and outside of giant robots.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the important part to get into next, naturally, is the synopsis. What the heck is a Macross? And it goes like this. A large unidentified object crash lands in the Pacific Ocean, spurring humanity to unify the entire Earth and restore that object in hopes of voyaging to the stars and discovering new worlds and life forms. However, one of those life forms arrives on Earth to start a war with the rebuilt object, now christened the Macross. It is here that the crew and the UN Spacey's new transforming fighter jets, the VF-1 Valkyries, stand against the warfaring Zentradi. And along the way, an up-and-coming pop idol brings an end to the war through the power of music and culture, which, doesn't sound like a big deal, that last point, but you'd be wrong.
Oh, yeah, if there's one thing that defines Macross, it's the power of music. Especially in the later entries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and depending on how you feel about when works of fiction utilize the power of music for good, how you feel about that, I think says all that I need to know about, your qualities as a person. So how did something like this happen? This sort of space opera of a mecha anime that apparently also includes, J-pop in the middle of it. Well, Macross's beginnings can be found at Studio Nue. Not a new studio by this point, I should add. It had already existed well during the 1970s under a different name as Crystal Art Studio. This anime was one of the earliest examples born from the Gundam boom. It's important to note how, a lot of the inspirations that went into mecha anime during the 70s came about, where it's obviously the primary inspiration for super robots of that time would have been Mazinger, but just doing Mazinger again would not cut it, just straight up plagiarist. So you'd have to pull from other sources of inspiration, effectively outside of anime, because this is very much the sort of thing where it's early enough in the medium's life that not enough has been built up that creators can come into it and just pull from that same medium they're working in and then be oh, I can take this element and use this as a base to create something different. Gundam, by the time it came out and started to gain its huge surge of popularity that it did in the early 80s, Macross was pretty much in the right spot to become the earliest example of actively being inspired by Gundam, to the point where a good number of its key creators were fans of Gundam.
Yeah, and you can definitely see it a lot, especially in the original show, where it's they're trying to make their own take on the themes of Gundam, but maybe not as depressing or as harsh as Gundam is.
They definitely wanted to go for like a different vibe, and to an extent, like even like very early on in production, like the show went by different names and was wrestling with different concepts that would kind of oscillate back and forth in a lot of ways depending on how serious or how lighthearted it wanted to be. Like as far as names go, Studio Nue's original idea was that they wanted to call it the Mega Road because the whole idea with the show was to be like it taking place on this gigantic ship housing like basically like a small town or small city population, taking them on a journey through space. You know, it was like hence like Mega Road. More interestingly from that, Studio Nue's like primary financier for the project, Big West, wanted the show to be called Macbeth because Big West's company director was a fan of Shakespeare and thought that the name alone would help it stand out, which, you know, I appreciate the line of thought, but I think you would have had to dedicate the show to being like a sci-fi giant robot retelling of Macbeth in order to justify the name to begin with.
Yeah, I think the show would have been very different if they had went with that name. But of course, you know, when you say that, I think a giant robot retelling of Macbeth would actually kind of rule.
I mean, you could pull off a lot of shit with like doing like giant robot retellings of like classic literature.
Hell yeah. Yeah, give me all kinds of Shakespeare works.
Give me Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but with giant robots.
Hell yeah.
Those officers were larger than life the way that they were written in the book. You could get away with making giant robot versions of them.
And it wouldn't seem that strange.
But between the two names of Mega Road and Macbeth, that was actually how they were able to eventually land on the final name of Macross. But even so, the name Mega Road would still see some use in like future in-universe material. Like it basically did not get abandoned even if it did not become the final title of the show. But more interestingly, it's not going to be elaborated on like too much more like during this episode, but like the full title of the original anime, which is Super Dimension Fortress Macross, the Super Dimension part of it was actually like a subtitle that during the 80s was planned as like something that would be used with a bunch of other like sci-fi mecha anime or just sci-fi anime in general to kind of not make it like part of a connected universe, but more like a connected like meta series in a sense, you know, something that could like share the same themes and ideals without being tied to like the same like kind of universe and canon. So yes, we have like our main players as far as like studios. So, you know, you got Studio Nue, who's like basically the one that like in charge of like the main production and animation. Big West are like the sponsors, financiers for the project. But like there's obviously key personnel working like at these studios that were very important. And this is where it gets back to what I was talking about, where Macross is very much a product of the Gundam boom and how like it's able to like take a lot of its inspirations more so from being anime fans themselves first and foremost, rather than people that ended up finding their way into anime and bringing outside influences into it.
Yeah.
And that came from like 3 members of a Gundam fan club called Gunsight 1.
Yeah.
Gunsight 1, also a name that will show up a couple of times if you actually watch Macross. So again, like they like to make sure that no good idea goes left behind. But the club's 3 members were Hiroshi Onogi, who is the writer for the show, Haruhiko Mikimoto, who's the character designer, and most famously, the mecha designer, Shoji Kawamori. I don't think this guy needs that much of an introduction. Well,
maybe a little.
If Kuryo Okuwara is like number 1 mecha designer of all time in terms of like impact and like their overall legacy, Shoji Kawamori is right up there at like number 2, but like very close. In my opinion, there's not much of like a distance between the two. And for my money, I am a huge fan of Kawamori's designs, the most out of all mecha designers out there.
Yeah, for the people who don't know, this is the guy who's made mecha designs for lots of series, and it has made some mechanical designs for movies like Ghost in the Shell, and has worked on most of the Armored Core series, and he's still working now, actually.
I mean, for fuck's sake, he made like the Devil Breaker arms that Nero uses in Devil May Cry 5.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Yeah, they're just prosthetic arms, but I mean, like they're still really cool. And like to tie this back around to robots at the end, he was involved in like making a lot of like transforming robot designs for what was initially Takara's Diaclone toy lines in 1980, but would later be designs used in the creation of Transformers. So yes, you have Shoji Kawamori to thank for Optimus Prime.
He designed Transformers, y'all. He's the reason why we have that in the first place. Or kind of.
And transforming robots in particular are going to be a major part of Macross. Like, the Valkyries, we'll get more into the specifics when we get to the primary mecha section of the show, but it goes without saying that, these are, his pride and joy of the original anime and, the rest of the series. Their general design, their transformation mechanisms, how they function and, work as a believable part of, the series universe. It's fantastic. I love everything about his designs. It's genuinely inspiring.
And he started off as a member of the Gundam fan club. That's crazy that a bunch of anime fans just came together and said, what if we just made our own series? That's the dream right there.
Yeah, and getting to make their own Gundam-inspired mecha anime with the help and backing of already big established studios like Studio Nue, and on top of that, they even got some additional contributors from, by this point, veteran and well-respected members of the anime industry. For instance, Kazutaka Miyatake, a veteran animator and designer whose work can be seen in various Zentradi units in the show, as well as the titular Macross. A lot of his work can be seen in a lot of the ship designs because he worked on stuff dating all the way back to Space Battleship Yamato. As far as mechanical designs, less so than robots, he is much more familiar and intimate with the designs of spaceships for sci-fi anime. And then the second contributor is Ichiro Itano, who's been well known for having a fantastic attention to detail and sense of motion. He's also worked on various episodes of Mobile Suit Gundam, the original anime, and it makes a lot of sense, especially because those are typically on episodes that were from the latter portion of the series, kind of around the point when the crew is almost done doing what they need to on Earth and are about to return to space. I'm pretty sure I'm not mistaking this, but I'm pretty sure the scene where the white base departs from Jaburo, and it's the scene where you just see the hundreds upon hundreds of birds flying away as the ship takes off. That was him.
I believe that. I believe he's the kind of guy who would do that.
He also worked on Space Runaway Ideon, a show that we will also talk about much, much later in the future. And of course, Macross itself, and it is here that the idea of the Itano Circus would be formed, because if there is one thing that became very famously attributed to him, it is Macross's penchant for tons and tons of missiles just flying all over the screen. You will never see a missile in a Macross anime of any kind go in a straight line ever.
Yeah, if you ever watch an anime and there's a scene where there's a bunch of missiles just flying everywhere in all sorts of directions, it's because of this man. He did it so well, they named it after him, and he did it the best.
The Itano Circus. Other times, it has also been referred to as the Macross Missile Massacre, which I love that alliteration.
It's so good.
But for real, for a show that was set to run on Japanese TV in 1982, just only 3 years after Gundam, they had quite the all-star cast of newcomers and veterans working on this thing. Even so, to the point where they had to get quite a bit of extra assistance from other studios to make sure that the project could be made a reality. Obviously we had Big West providing the funding to Studio Nue, who would handle production. So some of these studios that would come in to be outsourcing were owned by Tatsunoko Productions. And this leads into a bit more of a complicated kind of interconnected deal between these that becomes a lot more apparent once you get into the aftermath of when the show aired, because Tatsunoko's involvement was that they would come in with their studios to help on the animation production of various episodes to meet their deadlines, but as part of that partnership, they would provide the extra help and the funding, but in exchange they would get the rights for international distribution. Keep that idea of distributing Macross outside Japan in mind, because it is both a blessing and an even bigger curse when it actually comes into play.
We're doing this little thing called foreshadowing for a later part.
I mean, for fuck's sake, it's Macross. There is no way that we could ever get through an entire episode about it without bringing this thing up, because it has been a thorn in, like, the side of every fan out there.
Yeah, there is a reason why Macross hasn't had much of an impact in the West, and it's because of something we'll talk about later.
But we've covered everything that was of importance for what led to, like, you know, the formation of the idea behind Macross leading up to when it would eventually air on TV. So obviously we got to get into the part of the show where we talk about the real meat of the topic at hand, and that is the mecha. We got to talk about all the robots that we get to see, both on the side of the UN Spacey and the Zentradi. And compared to when we talked about the Gundam series, of which there is an assload on both sides, mostly on Zeon, but even then, the Federation still gets quite a lot. As far as Macross, there's like only really like just a very select few you need to know about because of how often you see them and because of just how much attention is given to like their functions and use cases within battles. And I think the first clear example to focus on is the VF-1 Valkyrie itself. You know, Shoji Kawamori's prized creation of the Macross series. The transforming mecha that is able to change between 3 different forms for 3 different levels of engagement in combat. These are Fighter, Gerwalk, and Batroid. The fighter form is essentially a fighter jet. I'm pretty sure around this time it would have still been like based on like the F-16 or like some like equivalent of like everyone knows about from the 80s. I think arguably more so because of stuff like Top Gun, which would have come later during the decade.
Yeah.
But that's the idea. And you can see where Kawamori working with Takara on the Diaclone series prior, which were all about robots that could transform into vehicles. Like, naturally, like the Valkyries kind of adhere to the same idea where its default form is a vehicle. It is a fighter jet.
Yeah.
To skip ahead just briefly before we circle back to like the second form, but Batroid is essentially like the humanoid robot form. You know, has 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. The machine gun that is usually attached to the underside in fighter form becomes, you know, like an actual like handheld rifle. What's important to note is because I said there are 3 different forms it can change into. You would think that something like this only needs 2, but no. There's a third. It's an in-between form known as Gerwalk.
Yep.
It's an acronym that I don't even remember what like all the different letters stand for, and frankly, I don't think anyone cares to anymore. Imagine the fighter form, basically like the engine's fuselage of the fighter jet form itself, flip downward to become legs, and then like its arms come out while holding the machine gun like gun pod.
Yeah.
It's a very goofy looking thing to anyone that is not initiated into what Macross is, but it serves a very, very clear purpose in combat.
Yeah, also I feel like I could be wrong about this, but before Macross, you had transforming robots. You had robots that like go from one form to another, but they didn't care if it made sense. But with Macross, there's really attention to detail and how it transforms. Like they really made sure that no, you can see how this can transform into this.
And be able to transform into something that looks like a real-life vehicle. Yeah. Because obviously, like we mentioned, like the first fully transforming robot being Brave Raiden, even its like transformed vehicle form is something that does not look like it adheres to any sort of sensible design in how a vehicle of that type would be made.
Yeah.
And then obviously there's the matter of like other robots that like mostly combine but have some transformation mechanism, you know, like Get a Robo or Combatler, where like you see that they clearly, especially in Get a Robo's case, it clearly does not give a fuck about conservation of mass.
It does not care. It makes no sense, but who cares? It's cool.
But it ultimately, I think, leads to the biggest irony when you consider how people that are not in the know seem to deride super robots from the 70s as just being big toy commercials, and that the real irony is that despite being a real robot anime, which is what Macross is, the Valkyries work much better as toys because their transformation sequences actually make sense. Like, if you had this idea in the 70s, toy sponsors would have been all over that shit.
Fucking I want to if I was a kid and I watched this, I would be like, I want a transforming toy of that. That's so cool.
And it's pretty much validated as well in terms of like the sound theory behind the transformation sequences that you still get toys still made to this day of like the different Valkyries from the series that have like all their transformation mechanisms perfectly replicated.
And Also, here's a quick fun fact that I like to mention. This is a show that was clearly like inspired by Gundam, but in like a way that everything just kind of circles around together. Gundam Zeta, the sequel series to original Gundam, was inspired by Macross. Because in Gundam Zeta, there's a lot of transforming mechs this time. And a lot of it was because they saw Macross and they're like, let's do that actually, so we can also make transforming Gunpla.
That would be especially important just because, like, for model kits already, especially with where Gunpla was very early on, not having that great of, like, articulation and other functions, like being able to, like, flex that ability by, like, improving, like, the manufacturing of those model kits, that it can allow for a transformation after assembled, like, that's pretty good. Yeah, like, transforming robots, really, they became a lot more well-known after Macross.
Oh, yeah.
And outside of, like, the transformation modes, in terms of, like, armaments, you know, there's a variety of them, but they're not, like, quite to the same, like, level of variety or occasional weirdness like you would have seen in even, like, the original Gundam. Mostly when it comes to Valkyries, you can expect to always see two things being used by them at the bare minimum. A gun pod rifle, which is, as I mentioned, it's usually attached to the underside as, like, the main machine gun in fighter form, and is otherwise handheld in Gerwak and Batroid. And the other is the fuckload of missiles.
Yeah, you are not going to see B rifles on a Valkyrie.
You do see, like, little beam lasers that emit from, like, antenna on the head, but they're so piddly. Like, they're even, like, less significant than Mazinger's photon beam.
Yeah.
But at least as far as, like, other armaments, one thing that I should mention as well that shows up occasionally, because Macross does occasionally have fights in space. You know, they have battles that will take place outside of the presence of atmosphere or gravity. Valkyries can be equipped with, like, extra armaments that would only really be practical or usable in the confines of, like, a zero-G environment. So just, like, the super packs and strike packs. Just imagine these as, like, gigantic cannons that are affixed to the top of the hull of the Valkyrie when it's in fighter form, and, like, a bunch of other, like, missile launch platforms as well attached to it, designed to be, like, super big, heavy firepower that, yeah, you can imagine from a real world perspective that this thing would just crumble under its own weight if it had to use it, like, on, like, a terrestrial body.
I think this really shows how much they were thinking about the mech designs in the show and how they would work in, you know, different situations, because they didn't have to design something like this.
No, they thought this was, like, a better avenue to go down than instead of trying to make their own imitation of Minovsky particles or some bullshit.
Yeah.
That's the Valkyries. There's all kinds of, like, armaments and, like, kind of slight variations that you get on, like, the VF-1s themselves, but they otherwise all serve, like, the same function, and you see them everywhere in the show. Especially when it comes to, like, the main characters, you'll be able to identify them because they always have, like, their signature paint jobs. But otherwise, it's like, yeah, it's nothing quite in the same way of how, like, super robots of the 70s had very distinct different types of robots, or even Gundam, where you had, like, you know, like, the main crew of the white base having their mobile suits serve different combat functions. It's like, it is very much like dogfighting, you know, like aerial combat. That is very much what it is, but imagine if the fighter jets could turn into giant robots. That's the beauty of Macross. And speaking of the name Macross, you know, we also got to talk about, like, the other major mecha, in fact, a singular one in this case on the side of the UN Spacey, and that is the SDF-1 Macross, rebuilt from a large ship belonging to what was known as the Supervision Army and had crash-landed on Earth in 1999. And, like, this is, like, kind of as we described, it is the ship that serves as both a military vessel and its own city, in which 50,000 plus civilians are being transported on it because, shit goes down in the first few episodes for anyone that has watched it. Important to note, much like with the Valkyries, guess what? The Macross also transforms.
That's like a giant humanoid robot, and it looks so cool. One thing I appreciate that they showed in the original series especially is whenever it transforms, you actually get to see the insides of what happens to the city when it does. Like
the order to transform the Macross is something that, like, requires pre-advanced notice to every citizen living inside the Macross that this ship is going to transform. Get into your fucking bunkers.
That's what you have to deal with when your city is also a transforming robot.
It's also got some pretty sick as hell attacks, especially the Daedalus attack.
For sure.
Which, just to describe that briefly for anyone that wants like another incentive as to why they should check out Macross, the Daedalus attack is where the Macross, in its transformed robot form, takes its arm, which looks like, like the forearm is basically like in the shape of like a gigantic aircraft carrier, punches it into an enemy ship, like busting through the hull, and then you would think that would be the end of it because it's a giant robot fist the size of a ship punching through you. Oh no, as soon as the arm is inside the ship that it is targeted, every vehicle and piece of stationary artillery attached to that arm deploys and just shoots and blows up the ship from the inside, and you can see it from like the outside, like the exterior of the ship swell up before it explodes in various points in a way that's like, oh, it's so cool. Like, it's another one of those touches where it's like, yeah, of course this was an anime where they got Ichiro Itano and a bunch of other kick-ass animators to like work on this thing. When it's firing on all cylinders, it is a beautiful thing to watch.
We've talked before about how the original Gundam kind of doesn't look great. The original Macross, it still has its budget moments, but when it looks good, holy shit, it looks good. Especially during the sequences like the ones you described.
Yeah, it is not to say that like it is obviously like always a looker all the time. It does have its moments where things look off model, but as you'll find between Gundam and Macross, the moments in which they become off model are kind of the inverse of like the opposing series. Like, it was always like the mecha in Gundam that tended to like look really off a lot of the times, whereas Macross knows how to like make its robot fights look awesome. But be careful which way you look at the human characters when we're at like part of the show where we have to get into some character drama.
We had to sacrifice the budget somewhere, and
more like we had to string some shit together when some of our animators fell ill due to overwork.
Okay, there is also that.
Stop me if you've heard that before.
Wow, animators getting overworked. I've never heard about that happening in the anime industry.
But that's the major like robot units that are on the side of the UN Spacey. What about the Zentradi though? Our antagonists. Most of their forces are generally in the form of like ships. Like that's another part of like kind of the beauty of Macross is getting to see just like overwhelmingly huge fleet sizes. But they do have like like mecha of their own that they use to kind of attack on the front lines. Most commonly is the Regalt. It's basically like a battle pod. Like, just imagine like an orb with like chicken legs, like a chicken walker type of leg set up for it. One of the more common combat vehicles deployed by the Zentradi. It does have like a more heavily armored version that with a slightly different design called the Glaug. But yeah, the whole idea essentially is that like it's the bare minimum of what you could call like a robot, essentially. Like a pilotable robot. It has legs, it has weapons, it counts, I guess.
It's definitely more of a combat vehicle than a actual like defined mech.
Yeah, but they do eventually show that they have that they actually have some mecha of their own that make for pretty comparable rivals to the Valkyrie. Most notably is the Quidlin Rao. It's a battle armor piloted by the female members of the Zentradi, because yes, this is an important thing to get into about the Zentradi forces and how they're set up, is that not only do they have like male and female genders, but the way that they're set up as kind of like a military power essentially is that both genders are kept separate from each other at all times. Which also leads to like a very clear divergence in like their sort of armaments and other equipment based on like on their particular needs. So the female Zentradi, which are known as the Meltrandi in this case, basically get they pretty much have like the ideal like combat weapon for like going toe to toe with a Valkyrie, like, which is something that like not even like the male regular Zentradi even have access to, because these things are like, they are super maneuverable. They can fly around, they can fire missiles. They are like the perfect opponent for dogfights with Valkyrie. And as a thing to add to this by the end is that eventually the male Zentradi do get their own equivalent like kind of battle armor mecha to fight with, called the Nujadel Gur. I'm pretty sure I did pronounce that correctly, because the spelling of Zentradi names is all kinds of fucked up.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's going to care that much if you mispronounce it. Oh, also, I don't know if we mentioned it, but the other thing about the Incentrati is that they're giants. They're like space giants.
Yes. That's kind of implied by like the fact I called the Quinlan Rao battle armor,
Yeah.
because like the amount of space inside them that the Meltrandi take up is, they are not in a cockpit that is of similar size to what the humans are using in the Valkyries. Zentradi, Meltrandi, they are all giant humanoids.
Yeah.
They can shrink down if they need to, Myclonization is what they call it, if they need to like infiltrate and gather intel on their enemies, because I guess there are no other species in the known universe that are giant sized like them.
Just big boys.
They're just big green boys engineered for war. They're basically the orcs before the orcs ever became a thing in Warhammer.
I think, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
They don't propagate through spores, but I mean, they might as well just by their sheer numbers. So yeah, those are the units. And now we got to get into the actual characters behind them on the UN Spacey and the Zentradi side. And compared to the mecha units that we talked about, there is a lot to kind of go over as far as characters on both sides, because it ties in especially to how this show is ultimately differing from an anime like Gundam in its portrayal of like a war between two sides, putting a lot more emphasis on like exploring the more like human character relationships, even when it comes to relationships between both sides. So the first of these characters on the side of the UN Spacey is our protagonist, Hikaru Ichijo. So a civilian pilot that gets invited to the Macross's inaugural launch on South Itaria Island. But like all good anime mecha protagonists, he gets wrapped up in this by accidentally falling into the cockpit.
As you do.
Yeah, he gets like, he has to get like a quick trial by fire lesson as far as like how to pilot a Valkyrie, which is also where like you get to see in very loving detail how the mechanism for transforming between all three forms work. But after surviving that, and then the events on South Itaria Island requiring the Macross to basically warp out with the island's 50,000 plus civilians, Hikaru decides to join the UN Spacey and becomes an important pilot in Skull Squadron.
Mm-hmm. Also, Hikaru is definitely a very different character from Amuro or even like Koji, especially like in the early days of like Macross, because he's a lot more, would you say he's more positive than Amuro?
I think he's at least like, he does not have the signs of being like as introverted or just like not as comfortable like understanding people.
Yeah.
Considering the comments I've made regarding how new typism might as well be a misdiagnosis of autism.
Yeah.
but no, Hikaru seems a lot more kind of on the more normal side of things, but he clearly has like, as the show goes on, like his main struggle comes in the form of romantic feelings that he is battling with.
Oh yeah, there is. We deal a lot more with romance here than we ever do in Gundam.
And our next two characters we have to talk about actually factor into that quite heavily. The next is Lin Minmei, a young girl from South Itaria Island who has aspirations of becoming a pop idol. And yes, from South Itaria Island, that means she is also on the Macross when all this is happening. But her music, as like she finally gets a breakthrough into her career and starts becoming popular, it eventually grabs the attention of the Zentradi and becomes vital to bridging the gap between the two species. Because, surprise, surprise, the Zentradi, a warfaring race of giants, has never heard of music.
And it blows their mind when they hear it. They're like, holy shit, this is what you all have been listening to?
If you want to know immediately, like, wires are getting crossed in your head right now. If you've never heard of Macross up to this point, but are listening to the way we talk about it, if you've clued into the fact that, like, the key differentiating factor in how Macross approaches war in an anime compared to Gundam is the use of culture shock, congrats, you nailed it on the head. That is exactly what is happening in this.
Yeah, the lines are definitely not as harsh as a Gundam, because there's a lot of connecting with other people in this show through culture.
It is essentially like the third option, I guess you could say, in terms of like how someone would want to resolve a conflict, the initial two being to either win and subjugate or surrender and die. And the third option in this case is like, fuck fighting, why do we need to do this? She's Lin Minmei as well is also the initial love interest with Hikaru, and to the point where it's like when you first watch this show, you think that like these two are written to be together by the end of it. But surprise, surprise, Macross is actually a story about a love triangle because there's a third person that gets introduced into this. You see her in the first episode, but it is not clear at all that she is going to become like a key player in this triangle until like a pivotal moment a third of the way through, and that is Misa Hayase. She's a bridge officer on the Macross, and because of Hikaru getting wrapped up in the initial attack by the Zentradi and having to fight them off, their introduction to each other is less than flattering for either of them. It's only after like a key moment when Hikaru, Misa, and like a few others are like captured by the Zentradi that like a bond between those two actually starts to form. No doubt after a moment in which they are being interrogated about their culture and the Zentradi ask, kissing. What is kissing?
They don't know much. They don't know anything that's not war.
For fuck's sake, like both male and female Zentradi live separately from each other.
I just have a quick question. Are you Team Lin or Team Misa?
Oh, Team Misa.
Okay, good. I'm glad. I'm going to pretend I'm just shaking your hand now. Team Misa forever. I was never on Lin's side.
Lin as a character, I think like the role that she is supposed to play, especially with her personality, is like it works the way it is supposed to. I believe there were even comments from Shoji Kawamori and other staff that worked on Macross that they deliberately made her to be a divisive character. The part where she's a pop idol is supposed to appeal to a certain group of people, but then it's contrasted by the fact that she has a fairly selfish, focused personality on her aspirations, which is what is able to like give this whole love triangle the room it needs to like actually be a proper triangle and not just one-sided. Because I'll say as much since the show is over 40 years old. Misa wins in the end.
Oh yeah.
Even the show understands that this was the right decision. Yeah.
And they were correct for that because Misa's the better choice.
Macross in general, I would say, is for the most part like pretty much correct with who ends up being the winner in their love triangles, I'm going to say.
Oh yeah, it's not going to be the last Macross with a love triangle in it.
No, it is very much a recurring thing. Some of them are more free than others. Like there are some where you look at the pairing and you're like, oh yeah, this is in the bag from like episode 1. But like the remaining important characters that need to be covered, Roy Fokker. No, I did not missay that. Shut up. Is a friend of Hikaru, actually. He was already part of the UN Spacey by the time that the show starts, but it was obviously like they're both pilots, one in the military, one who's a civilian. And it was like, hey, I got stationed at this pretty cool gig here in the Pacific where this gigantic robot ship got rebuilt. You want to check it out? And it's like Hikaru getting roped into the entire plot can ultimately be traced back to Roy doing his friend the solid and just giving him like kind of an advanced trip to check out something really awesome. Like he's the leader of Skull Squadron among like the various like Valkyrie formations on the Macross, and is a very formidable pilot in his own right. Bit of a smooth talker though. I mean, like this dude is like he's blonde hair, like his name is blatantly American. He's that kind of character, but he's at least like still enough of like a likable kind of character.
Yeah, he's
despite like some of those flaws.
He's still like a cool bro for most of the series, I'd say. Thankfully, he doesn't fall into the same trap that a lot of characters like him fall into, and by that I mean being a big womanizer, which I don't think he is, right?
No. After a point, he very much like clearly has his eyes on like one particular character that's part of the bridge crew, and like it's actually like a, you know, fairly standard relationship. Like there's nothing about it that is like, you know, like toxic or him like kind of just using her as like a fling, like the character in question being Claudia, who's actually who's a black woman.
Yeah,
interracial relationships that is portrayed positively in the 80s from Japan. That's another interesting quality to note as well regarding Macross overall, is that it does have a much more positive outlook on like the future of humanity, like kind of approaching Star Trek levels. Maybe not to the same degree that originally had in mind when making the original Star Trek, but very much the idea of humanity overcoming like all of like the differences that have like kept it divided like throughout its history.
Yeah, it is. I think the Star Trek comparison works because especially compared to Gundam, where Gundam is it's very negative about a lot of things. And it has I don't want to say nihilistic, because I think nihilistic is too strong a word, but
it is very much a series that is defined about showing like the horrors of war, particularly when it is wars between like two groups of people. of the same race.
Yeah, and Macross, as we keep mentioning, is way more like has a way more positive outlook in the future of humanity and just like how it handles its conflicts and all that, and even with its characters.
Mm-hmm. Alas, Roy Fokker does not live to see the end of the show. He's gets done in by the dreaded pineapple.
He's unfortunately too cool to live.
He is cool enough to survive like an enemy round piercing him through the cockpit and like still holding like the will to just get out and like go visit Claudia one last time because she promised to make him a pineapple salad. I appreciate the dedication, but I think this is also more than anything. This is how you know that I'm on a different wavelength from like when other people are kind of doing the meme shit of like pineapple on pizza, what is wrong with you?
Mm-hmm.
And being like, my reason for being against pineapple on pizza or pineapple in any form is because that's what made us lose Roy in the first place.
That's very valid.
If someone offers me pineapple, be it a salad or anything, I am going to become deathly afraid.
I can't believe we lost the best bro. And you can feel it in the show because after he dies, things kind of take a downward spiral for Hikaru.
Yeah, it's another trial he has to endure kind of like during his whole journey.
Yeah,
but that's really only like the major casualty when it comes to like our important named characters, kind of thankfully, because we still got other characters that stick around all the way to the very end. One of them is Maximilian Genius himself. Who's a young pilot that joined Skull Squadron like partway through the series, like younger than even Hikaru is technically, and is an absolute ace with a Valkyrie and pretty much anything that he does. And more than that, he is, as I like to affectionately call him, the original space fucker. He becomes the center of bridging the human and Zentradi races via interspecies marriage.
And let's not forget that he met his future wife via knife fight.
Yes, or at least that's one interpretation of it. Yes, that is what I was talking about with, like, interspecies marriage. The assailant was a Zentradi.
Yeah, who tried to kill him.
Yeah.
But then they ended up making out.
Yeah. When it comes to, like, we don't really bring it up too often just because of how many, like, voiced characters we're naturally going to bring up a lot on this program. But in the case of Maximilian Genius, I do need to bring up at least like his voice actor because he would go on to be like a pretty recognizable one in so many anime from here on out, and that is Sho Hayami. Yeah, you'll especially hear his name be brought up again by me when we do next week's episode because he plays a pretty predominant role in that. Regardless, he would remain the voice of Max even to the point where like Maximilian Genius continues to show up in a couple more Macross entries even after this point. You get to see him through the ages. Even when he becomes an old man, he is still a badass.
Mm-hmm. He's definitely, like, out of the entire cast, he's the one you see the most, and he's cool no matter which version of him you see.
They try to add wrinkles and gray hair to him, and I'm like, oh no, you just made him cooler.
Yeah.
Give me more mecha grandpas, that's all I'm saying.
Oh, we need more mecha grandpas in general.
So that's like a lot of our major human characters. You know, I mean, like there's some that I know I kind of omitted for time or whatever, like members of the Bridge Crew or other members of Skull Squadron. Well, more like one other member of Skull Squadron, but he's kind of a fuck up. So we don't need to focus too much on Kakizaki.
No, we don't.
Instead, let's get to like some of the key Zentradi characters because, you know, much like our human cast, they do also get quite a bit of focus in order to show that despite the difference in alien origin, it's like they are still capable of like kind of understanding and like feeling the same things that humans do. So to start, we have Britai Kridanek, one of the Zentradi generals that is seen very early in the series. He has a distinct metal plate over one of his eyes. His crowning achievement in combat is getting a surprise attack on a Valkyrie with a metal pipe to the head. That is not a lie.
Nope, that is not an exaggeration. That actually happens.
Most Zentradi would need to like go into battle with at the very least a Regalt in order to deal with one of these Valkyries, but nah, Britai just goes in for a sneak attack like by himself with a pipe that is sized up to fit in his hands.
Which, you know what? I'd say that's a baller move.
So much so that it's like one of the PSP games I'm pretty sure does have Britai as a playable character, and his melee weapon is that pipe.
Oh, that's incredible. That's a good decision.
The Macross PSP games by Artink, by the way, are fucking fantastic, both to play and as like a source of like just all kinds of fan service, like all the major things you recognize and some deep fucking cuts. Other Zentradi is Exodol Fulmo, who's like another one of the Zentradi generals that is typically seen alongside Britai. Unlike Britai, he doesn't fight in battle, but much like Maximilian Genius, he does get to live past the original Macross anime to make appearances in future entries. Unsurprisingly, it's actually like in the same like instances where Max is also present.
Yeah, he ends up becoming a pretty important character as well throughout Macross.
Like, if there's a good way to describe Britai and Exodol as a duo, is that Britai, based on what I described as his crowning achievement, he is definitely the kind of person that is, like, well-suited to, like, enacting, like, plans of action, whereas Exodol has a lot more of, like, a strategist vibe to him. Like, he's, like, much more analytical of the situation and devising plans from there. And, like, his roles kind of past the original Macross kind of serve to reinforce that. But other Zentradi, outside of those two, we have Kamzin Kravjera, who is a young, hyper-aggressive Zentradi dickhead who wants nothing more but to fight any and all enemies as a Zentradi wants to do.
Yeah, he's just the war-minded one. He just wants to fight all the time.
Even to the very end when he actually does get killed. It's like, compared to other Zentradi, especially as the series goes on and shows that, you know, the Zentradi are able to change and, like, find that there is, like, more to, like, living their lives than just waging war. Kamjin is just one of those, like, misguided young males, probably, like, totally swayed in by doctrine entirely, just thinking, no, this is who I am. Kamjin would basically be a chud in the modern age, is all I'm saying.
He's definitely, like, he becomes, like, I think he's the main villain of the second half of the show, right? Like, he still
He does. Well, considering how short it is, it feels weird to call it a half. I always refer to it as, like, an epilogue.
Yeah, the epilogue, I think, is a better way to put it.
Because it's after, like, the proper war with the Zentradi is over and humanity is trying to rebuild along with the Zentradi, and Kamjin is just like, fuck your cooperation bullshit.
Fuck you too, you warmongering pretty boy. Why'd they have to make him so pretty, though? It's, like, kind of a shonen face.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame, but even then, like, this particular character archetype would not die with Kamjin. There is at least some other, like, entries in the series after this where they have to get someone that kind of fills the same role of so hyper-aggressively devoted to, like, the cause of their war, even when they're clearly in the wrong. Like, it ultimately shows that, yeah, most people on the opposing side can be brought to, like, reform in ways that don't require, like, overwhelming force and subjugation, but you're always going to run into exceptions, and Kamjin is one of them.
Yeah, there's always going to be the one who's going to keep the conflict going.
Or two in the case of, like, our of the characters I decided to highlight. But one of those that does change is Milia Falina, who's a Meltrandi, you know, the female Zentradi we talked about, who's an ace pilot on their side that is, like, considered to be the best far and away among her peers, which means, boy, does she get into a lot of skirmishes with Max and his Valkyrie throughout the series, and is the one that tries to assassinate him on the Macross. But instead, they get married. They have, like, 8 kids. And at least one of them becomes a pretty important character in Macross 7.
It's so funny how, like, Maximilian Genius and Milia are not, like, the main characters, but they're the ones who have the most impact on the series, way more than Hikaru does.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the role they play has, like, it has so much more far-reaching consequences and, like, and just impact on where, like, the future of, like, the Macross universe goes, basically. We always talk about that there's always that one person or two that just does not want to change. And the other one is Bulldozer, which I think, like, I always remember, like, before getting the official spelling, it always sounded like bulldozer. But he is the supreme leader of the Zentradi, and unlike all the other Zentradi, like, the thing that causes him in particular to want to, like, not give in to, like, the culture shock being demonstrated by the humans is because he recognizes them as being descendants of the proto-culture, which is, like, Kind of a common thing in a lot of sci-fi franchises wherever you look. There is always the idea of like the prototypical ancestor race from which all life in the universe essentially like is spawned from. The Zentradi are like somewhat different in that regard because of the fact that like they were more like just humanoid weapons designed to do a very specific purpose, a purpose that doesn't actually get elaborated on much until you get to like Macross 7 specifically. But humans are very much a result of like natural evolution coming as a result of protoculture deliberately setting the seeds for them. Because of that, and the fact that they came into possession of a vehicle that was owned by one of their enemies, Bodolser just does not want to take any chances or even the risk of like diminishing like the Zentradi's pride as a warrior race. So that's why he's always, while most of the Zentradi basically comes to peace, is that Bulldozer just does not and dies in the end. And those are our characters.
Yeah, that's, well, the major players. There's definitely way more characters, but they're not as important as the ones we mentioned.
They're not so important that we can like extend the time of the episode even further.
Oh yeah.
We got through a lot of like the characters, the robots. We described like what led to the creation of Macross itself. So now we got to get into like what we have been foreshadowing all this time. What is Macross's legacy? Like what impact has it led? Well, I guess one thing as well, just to tie back quickly to like when it was in pre-production, there was originally a plan to have the show be 48 episodes, but that was when it was like under like a different sponsor. But that company, I think like the deal, and then the company like kind of like went out of business. So because of that, they were originally going to settle on 27 episodes, which would have tied into like the end of the war with the Zentradi, the first space war, as it's called for humanity. But as we mentioned, there was like a bit, essentially an epilogue section. Like it got 9 extra episodes, boosting it to 36. But those 36 episodes aired on Japanese television from October 3rd, 1982 to June 26, 1983. Yeah, now we mentioned as much, Mazinger and Gundam's impact were both on the concepts of super robots and real robots respectively. But Macross's individual elements, it's weird. You look at them all in a list and it's like they seem pretty disparate from each other. And as well as disparate to like even other mecha anime like before and after it, but like it's still the sort of thing where like its ideas got picked up in various ways in future works both in and outside of the genre. We mentioned as much already about like the concept of transforming mecha becoming significantly more mainstream as a result of Macross. You know, between like Brave Raideen and the Diaclone Toys series, basically preceding it and, you know, being like an interesting kind of side thing from like the real appeal of giant robots were to people at the time. But with 1982 being when Macross came on the scene and popularized a lot of these like transforming robot mechanisms, it would be 2 years later when the Transformers toy line would finally start in earnest. Following that, obviously, is the story itself. Another thing we've alluded to plenty of times when talking about the characters is that like its portrayal of a war story significantly different. There's a lot more emphasis on showing the civilian's perspective on how things go, as well as, you know, just like kind of like the outlook of how a conflict like this can be resolved without resorting to like the traditional answers that you would have to settle on in any type of war.
Yeah.
And the big one, we can definitely talk about this more now because we mentioned as much with her character. Lin Min Mei, you know, if we want to extend from the concept of culture and culture shock, Lin Min Mei introduced the concept of the virtual idol. Essentially the fictional character that could be used as a stepping stone for a real artist's career. Because with Min Mei, like her voice actor did both like the regular voice acting and singing for Min Mei. It was Mari Ijima. And like that was essentially like her debut as a music artist, like completely. Like there wasn't, like I had to look up like her discography and whatnot, but like there did not seem to be any like prior work experience like in the music industry before this. Like this was as much like most other idols in Japan would like get their start like if they were lucky enough to get the attention of like a talent agency. In this case, instead of the attention of a talent agency, they got the attention of an anime studio. whose key members decided that this would be a good way, arguably more than the Big West CEO that wanted it to be called Macbeth. Like probably a better way of differentiating it by being like, what if we included J-pop? Because we're both fans of like pop idols, and it's reflected heavily when you listen to her music that like, it is very much Japanese pop music as defined by like what you would hear like in like music from the 80s in that country.
Which I do not think of I can't think of any other show, or at least any other mecha show before this that even tried anything like this, of making something like someone being an idol a huge focus, having a huge focus like this.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely point to like decades after the fact with like the crop of like idol anime that became like kind of like a big thing in the wake of Idolmaster and such. But even then, and also even as far as like music, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure like Symphogear is also like very much considered a Macross inspired franchise.
Music is also a big focus in Symphogear as well, because every time characters fight, they end up singing to their like song. Like you see them singing while they're fighting. So it's definitely a big part there.
And much like a lot of things that have been established with like this first Macross entry, between the transforming mecha, the outlook it has on like humanity and war and kind of how to overcome it, and like the love triangle angle as well for like its main character dynamics, like the virtual idol concept, or just virtual musician, I guess, to an extent, because like that's kind of hard to, it'll be clear once we get to talking about Macross 7, it is a bit hard to describe those as idols.
Oh yeah, it's maybe not as accurate.
Regardless, every major Macross series from here on has had music as like a core part of the franchise and a platform for in-universe music acts to like break out as legitimate artists. You know, and it's the sort of thing where this is something that like it definitely hit me in more recent years, especially with kind of our interests and kind of like the way in which that we've done live streams already and what our inspirations are for that. But it's not hard to draw a connection starting from Macross to how we got to things like Vocaloids and VTubers.
That connection is not as far out as you all might think. There might be something connecting them together.
Yeah, because if it's not apparent to anyone, like unless you guys have like followed our content before, it's like Neff is a VTuber. I've streamed this one as well. Like our main inspiration from it, admittedly, is like from the perspective of like using it as like a creative outlet to like have like our own spin or like way to like kind of like make our streams like stand out compared to what would be kind of the more standard kind of cliche way that like most people would present a live stream. But obviously, with a lot of the corporate-owned VTubers out there, you know, your HoloLives and whatnot, it very much becomes a lot more familiar to like kind of how Macross has like boosted various music artists and even been used as a way to like get their careers off the ground. I mean, like there are too many VTubers out there to count who have basically been able to like use the popularity and like fandom they gained from like being like corporate owned and having a large fan base to be able to, you know, like produce like their own single.
Yeah, a lot of them have become legitimate artists and have started selling albums.
It is totally a more normal and common thing than you might expect. Like, as much as VTubers are a very recent thing, and you still always see like some manner detractors as it being like some weird out of nowhere thing that you know, just the old people do not understand. But keep it in mind that there is a thought process behind those that could be traced all the way back to what this show did in the 80s.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe we have more to thank Macross for than we know. Who could say?
I mean, we definitely should be thanking him more. In fact, to the point where like it should be more well recognized.
It should be, but
as if you were to serve me like a perfect segue, we have to get into like an unfortunate part of Macross's impact.
This is a less fun part to talk about.
Although this first part, I think you can look at from the perspective of it being like actually kind of interesting to talk about, and that is the fact that the series saw international distribution like very soon after it had first aired in Japan, which is like kind of an unheard of thing when you think about like the history of anime, even when it comes to how like, because before this, you know, you had like anime that would like show up in like various other countries, but not so much like gaining traction in the US. Like we've talked about how like Grandizer was like a big staple of like pop culture in Saudi Arabia and Italy, but like even then when Grandizer was brought to those countries, it was like by the end of the 70s. It was already a good few years after it had finished on Japanese TV. Macross, meanwhile, it only took them 2 years for Tatsunoko to find a partner that could actually bring it like to the Western world. You know, that by itself was obviously a big deal considering anime as a whole did not get like a surge in popularity until like the 90s and early 2000s. You know, actually airing a lot more of those shows on American TV and like other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Because yes, this was what we were talking about. Tatsunoko's earlier partnership meant that they got the international distribution rights, so they could like, they were the ones that, you know, if someone looked at Macross and was like, we want to bring this over, Tatsunoko was who they had to talk to. And one of those companies that got in talks with Tatsunoko for the distribution was Harmony Gold. Trying my best not to bite my tongue saying this in disdain. They struck a deal with Tatsunoko in order to have the show edited and aired in the rest of the world as Robotech. An admittedly generic name, but fuck it. I guess there are people out there that still remember it.
There are definitely some people who are fans of Robotech. This is their first like exposure to Macross. And man, I'm going to be honest. I have no idea who I have more disdain for, Harmony Gold or Saban. They're both pretty equal in terms of my dislike for them.
Harmony Gold is like, imagine if Haim Saban did not make any more Power Rangers after the original Mighty Morphin, but was equally as litigious.
Yeah, pretty much.
Because here's the thing, like, despite the early distribution of Macross, you know, a TV anime outside Japan, you know, in 1984, we cannot stress enough, it became a huge problem for decades on this franchise due to legal complications. Issues that are too vast and too detailed to cover in a single episode, but since I am the one that like is able to have the time to put together all these notes, I have hopefully put together a decent summarization of what the fuck has been wrong with this, why we've not been able to get Macross in a legal capacity for decades. So I'll try my best to describe it as such. The short of it is that Harmony Gold has been nothing short of litigious and like cock-blocking of the entire rest of the franchise due to a misunderstanding behind the deal they made with Tatsunoko, because they assumed that the rights for international distribution had applied to Macross as an entire IP, whereas technically what Tatsunoko had the rights to basically make a deal with for international distribution was only something that was under the name of Super Dimension Fortress Macross. Basically, the TV anime only and its subsequent movie. Those were the rights that Harmony Gold had purchased in the 80s and were stuck with. And because of like how Robotech was set up, is that it wasn't just Macross. This is the part that makes it extra infuriating, and mostly on the part of whenever I see people that are like claim themselves to be Robotech fans, but only ever talk about the Macross part of Robotech. Because Robotech is not just Macross. It is a hybrid bastardization of 3 separate anime from the 80s, all completely unrelated to each other, not even shared by the Super Dimension moniker, I should add. Like that's how messed up it is, because the only way Harmony Gold was able to get it to air on TV for syndication in the West was if they had a high enough episode count to like basically present to the TV networks that it's like, okay, we have enough episodes that we can like set aside like this portion of time throughout like the year to basically dedicate to the show.
I've never watched Robotech. I've only watched the original Macross, but that sounds like a mess.
Especially when it does not do a lot to, in fact, actively tries to kind of fuck up a lot of like what Lin Min-mei's entire role in the story is supposed to be. And I think that also contributes to a lot to some of the hatred or misunderstanding that people have for her, just because they know about like kind of how like she was portrayed and how her songs were handled in the Robotech adaptation. You can probably imagine how that went. You know, considering that these are like Japanese pop songs.
Yeah, that's they probably didn't handle it well, is my guess.
No, but like because of all this, the fact that Harmony Gold like has essentially a hybridization franchise that includes like this one anime as a third of it, and its actual original owners would want to eventually continue it in their own way, that obviously is going to cause some amount of conflict and confusion from Harmony Gold's perspective, even though I think it would have been better for the rest of the world if they had just like scrapped that entirely, just got rid of Robotech, excised it completely from pop culture, and just supplanted it with Macross. But alas, they didn't want to play ball that way. So, like, not only that, like, it should be noted, there was at least a point where a temporary deal was worked out that I believe it was ADV, like an old anime English dub company at the time, was able to, like, put out, like, a actual for real like legal distribution of Macross unedited as it was with the English dub and everything, but that was very temporary and didn't like last long. That obviously took a lot of negotiating with Harmony Gold naturally, since like their rights pertain specifically to that show. But because of like all those kind of like conflicts and perceived confusion on their end, any future Macross entry could not be legally distributed unless it was part of Robotech, which they obviously were not going to abide by, considering that the canon of the Macross series did not truly become solidified into what we know it as until the 90s. There's a bit of a messiness as far as like when and how people wanted to make a follow-up to Macross itself, which we'll get into on the subsequent entries. It was a mess for the longest time. I say for the longest time because on March 1st, 2021, we are finally at the light at the end of this tunnel. An agreement was reached between Studio Nue, Big West, and Harmony Gold that would finally allow for international distribution of all major Macross series post-SDF. But I say post-SDF, though, because the deal was not perfect for us fans. A compromise still had to be made towards Harmony Gold that made it so that they could still continue to distribute Robotech the way they wanted, which meant that Big West and Studio Nue could not redistribute original Macross and its movie the way that it was originally supposed to. Kind of a shame.
Yeah, it's better than nothing.
But by this point, I think there's enough people out there that still need to get on our level and like watch some of the Macross entries that took place well after Super Dimension Fortress. Oh, it's been a long time coming leading up to that agreement. And then at the time of this recording, in 2024, various Macross TV anime and movies have finally made their way outside Japan through official channels. Like almost all of them are now on Disney Plus.
Yeah, we get Macross.
They have actual English subtitles now.
Yeah, we come a long way now because it's now a little more accessible than it used to be.
Granted, it's Disney Plus and not like, like a more anime dedicated streaming platform like Crunchyroll. Like, I think that would have been the expectation everyone had.
Yeah.
But, and also, I don't have Disney Plus, so I cannot verify to know if, like, I know that it's in various territories, but I don't know if those territories include the US or not yet. I just know that I have seen on torrent sites that people have uploaded the subtitle files specifically from Disney Plus, so I know those are out there. It's a matter of like whether or not they exist in actual English countries or if they were only available in like Southeast Asia or something where you typically get English subtitle releases as well. But regardless, I think the ultimate irony of this is that while I am glad to see that like this legal deadlock has for the most part been dealt with, I'm still keeping my illegally downloaded copies. I've had them for this long. I
mean, you might as well keep them since they're so precious now, and you'll never lose them that way.
Especially because I have no idea how detailed the official English subtitles for this go. Yeah. I do not know if they actually like showed the lyrics for when the various songs are playing, because there's a lot more singing. There is so much singing, even more as the series goes on.
Oh yeah, it definitely becomes way more idol focused.
So much so that I would say that it was Macross obtaining its true form.
Mm-hmm. This is where the real Macross starts. Also, this is going to be a little tinfoil hats, but we mentioned Super Robot Wars a lot on the show, and we're going to keep mentioning it. That's a game that was not officially localized until a few years ago, and when it did, that was like a miracle. That was like a thing nobody expected to happen. But for the longest time, I think they were trying to localize one of the games. I could be wrong. I could be talking out of my ass.
Yes, it was. I actually know what you're talking about because I've seen the same thing as well. I believe it was for Super Robot Wars Alpha.
Yes,
I think it was actually the Dreamcast port of all things, because this would have been in 2000. Gundam Wing had made a splash in the US. Alpha had Gundam Wing featured in it, so they naturally thought that was like, this would be a good opportunity to bring this over. People know what Gundam is now. And a lot of the rights for all the different anime that were featured in there were worked out.
Yeah.
Except Harmony Gold decided to just show up and be a bunch of fucking dicks.
Yeah, that's...
Because not only is Macross featured in Alpha, its plot actually factors heavily into the core plot of Alpha, that you cannot excise it without there being a way too big of a gap in like major events that take place.
Yeah, that's why I'm a little more grumpy about Harmony Gold, because they also stopped us from getting a localized Super Robot Wars game for a long time, it feels. I don't know if it was them. But,
and Macross would continue to show up in subsequent Super Robot Wars games after that point as well, which did not help matters, even when it was, clearly getting into Macross units that took place well after the original. And also, just to add even further to like how shitty of a company Harmony Gold is that anyone that is a fan of BattleTech and especially familiar with its early days might remember the Unseen, which were... It's kind of weird in this case whenever I look at it, because the designs of the Unseen robots are very much clearly just barely modified units from Macross, like designed to fit the specifications of BattleTech's rule sets. And yeah, those had to go away after a while because Harmony Gold threw a fit at them.
Oh, wow.
Again, they are nothing short of litigious.
Oh, wow. Yeah, those are literally just Macross units.
There's a bunch of other units that are also just straight up stolen from other mecha anime from that time as well. Like, I do understand it came from a place of the creators of BattleTech, obviously, like, got wind of like robot anime from the early 80s and loved it and wanted to like make their own version of it as a tabletop game, which I respect that, but because it's very clear like how its origins came about, that like it was essentially a good chunk of it just legally distinct modifications of existing robots. It only took them like a few more years until I think more easily defined robots in the BattleTech series you could look at and go, oh yeah, these are actually original. Like, you look at an Atlas and you're like, you're not mistaking that for another Japanese robot.
I'm not as familiar with BattleTech, but I'm not shocked to hear that.
Yeah, I got friends who are deep into BattleTech, so they would obviously know a lot more about the minutia, but don't you worry. They are also with us in our mutual hatred of Harmony Gold.
I'm glad. We're all like together in saying, man, they fucking suck. Fuck Harmony Gold. You know what's not depressing? It's Macross, and even with all of this, it still managed to like have a bunch of like series past the first one.
It took a while to get there, though, because as far as the subsequent entries, we could definitely use this as our segue to get into that now. So the first of these is, I've mentioned the name of this a few times, not the name, just the fact that it was the movie version, Macross Do You Remember Love? Interesting as far as anime movies based on TV series are concerned, because by this point, we had already been well aware of how the original Mobile Suit Gundam had the 3 compilation movies that served to like improve the animation and parts of the story. But Do You Remember Love is interesting because it is not a compilation movie. It is a completely like from the ground up, like fresh retelling with all new animation and like changes to the plot to make it like fit within the runtime of a feature-length movie. And if you thought parts of the TV anime were like very gorgeous to look at, as far as like TV anime of its time, oh boy, the movie's on another level.
It's a gorgeous movie. It looks so good.
If Akira did not get its anime film a few years later, I would be confident in saying Do You Remember Love is the best looking animated movie of the decade. But an interesting thing as well regarding the movie having a very heavily reworked plot and entirely new animation is it also led to some other things as far as like changes to how some of the Zentradi looked and things like that. And because of the fact that like its retelling of the plot is clearly not compatible with certain aspects of the TV anime, is that there was like basically a hand wave some time ago. In fact, it's still kind of maintained even in the Macross series that Do You Remember Love is actually an in-universe propaganda film. Yeah, that is not made up. Basically, like the in-universe retelling of what happened during the events of the first Space War.
And I love it. It's like the best way to do like a movie like this.
The future movies for other series don't really abide by this. They kind of abide by the idea of like the canon for this particular entry is whatever we decide it to be, even if we end up changing certain parts. But I think it's fine because, like, as you'll find, a lot of these entries don't have as much overlap with each other as you think.
Yeah.
Like, timeline always moves forward no matter what. And with Do You Remember Love, with Lin Min-mei having, like, quite a number of, like, recognizable songs from the TV anime, you know, stuff we didn't even mention the name of before, but things like My Boyfriend's a Pilot, Seventh Moon. Well, no, not Seventh Moon.
No,
it's Silver Moon.
Yeah.
Right. Seventh Moon's completely different. Xiao Pailon. But this movie also, like, I think had Lin Min-mei's absolutely defining song to the point where I think it's like, it's associated with her more than anything that she's ever sung. And that is the song that the movie's title is derived from. You know, the English title's Do You Remember Love? The Japanese title and the song title is Ai Oboete Imasu ka. It's beautiful.
If I remember right, the song plays while they're having a giant space battle, right?
It is the climactic battle that essentially, like, wins the war and saves humanity from extinction. It's real fantastic. You also get to see Bulldozer's head just get completely perforated and blown to bits because Japan in the 80s sure loved its gore. But following that, I mentioned as much that, like, it took a while for Macross to ever get, like, its actual proper sequel because, you know, like, there wasn't any new entry that came out in the 80s past Do You Remember Love. Obviously, Robotech happened outside Japan. In the early 90s, however, Big West wanted to put together, like, a sequel to the original anime as, like, a 10th anniversary thing. A 6-episode OVA called Macross 2, Lovers Again. And the important thing to note is that I specified this was Big West's doing because Studio Nue had no involvement with it whatsoever. And as a result, it's basically considered non-canon. It's also the only one on this list that I have not watched, I'm going to say. I've still not gotten around to it just because of the lack of importance. I don't even know if it's technically, like, good or bad, even in spite of, like, its relation to the rest of the Macross universe. I just know that, like, it was basically made kind of separately from, like, anyone that was involved in the original creation of Macross. Yeah, I can't really give a recommendation one way or the other on it.
I've also haven't watched as much Macross as I have, like, Gundam. I've watched a fair share of it, but not all of it, so some of it's still going to be new to me.
I think from what we had talked about, it's like we both more or less watch the same things up to a point, and then I basically just clear ahead of you in the latter half.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, so obviously we recommend the original Macross. That is definitely, like, the most recommendable of, like, kind of like the first entries in these major franchises we've talked about on this podcast up to this point. Do You Remember Love is also a fantastic watch, but it's, I think, equally important to watch that after you are familiar with the TV anime.
Yeah, this is not like a compilation movie. Like we mentioned, this is not like a Gundam situation where you can watch the movies and be caught up, because this is more of a supplementary material, like after you watch the show.
You know, it's still important to watch it just so you can see that final battle when the titular song is playing, because, like, it really is a beautiful thing to behold, both visually and orally. Like, I think it's, like, the best, earliest example of, like, kind of proving Macross's overall point of the power of music.
They really try.
Because, really, like, it ends the war, and it was just a simple little love song. That's literally what they call it in universe. It was just a love song, but it was powerful enough to touch the hearts of Zentradi everywhere. But those are, like, what basically existed during the first 10 years of the series. Now we got to get into Macross's actual true sequel, or sidequel, I guess, because it's still kind of in a spin-off territory. Yeah. And that is Macross Plus. Studio Nue, they finally returned to the series in full, 1994, set 3 decades nearly after the events of the original Macross. So, like, its big kind of draw is showing, like, Studio Nue and, like, its original team, like, their idea of how the Macross universe would have progressed technologically and culturally. Like, focusing on new characters, new love triangle, even a new pop idol. In fact, it's an actual, for real, virtual idol in universe that gets co-opted into trying to be used as an AI and causes all kinds of problems. Her name is Sharon Apple. Macross Plus, I think we clearly showed as much when we were talking about Gundam and how there are some opinions we have about those entries that are a bit differing from the popular trend. I'm going to put forward my first one for the Macross series.
Oh boy.
I don't think that hot about Macross Plus overall.
Wow.
Like, it is a gorgeously animated OVA. It actually makes use of like computer generated imagery, like in some very smart ways, to the point that it doesn't take you out of it, you know, like on like computer readouts and whatnot. The thing I highlighted about it is that what I find most commendable about it is showing how the Macross universe progresses in terms of its technology and culture in the events of like the first of the original Macross, which, oh, right, I guess I should have mentioned this, although I didn't make a bullet point for it because it's more of an extended music video. But there was Macross 2012 Flashback, which is like basically an even like an extra epilogue after you have watched Do You Remember Love. That the only thing you need to take away from it is that Minmay, Hikaru, and Misa all decide to take part in a big like spacefaring exploration journey where they board a ship called the Mega Road 1, bringing back that name.
Nice.
And in universe, that ship goes missing, but it's basically like the crux of humanity and Macross decides to do following the events of the war, in which they decide to spread their seed across the galaxy because they came so close to extinction. Like, humanity got fucking glassed. Everyone that was on Earth was wiped out in an instant, that they were like, we cannot stay on just the same planet and risk annihilation in the same way. So it's a more virtuous version of colonization, I guess you could put it.
Yeah.
Because it's not for motives that are the same way that like actual colonizers have in the past. I'm going to say.
We gotta do this or else our entire species is gonna die.
Our species and our culture along with it. And cross-culture, you know, collaboration is an important part of Macross. And you do see that in a lot of places as Macross Plus takes place, you know, like on other worlds outside of Earth. That said, the reason I don't really like it so much is that I don't think it works as like a story fitting of Macross itself. I think the more derisive short way I could describe it is that it is Macross for people that don't understand the importance of music in the series and just want Top Gun anime.
This is more Top Gun than original Macross. And especially like the love triangle here, it's instead of two girls fighting over one guy, it's two guys fighting over one girl, and that involves them trying to kill each other through planes, I guess, while yelling at each other.
Yeah, and even then, the triangle in question is already like, it presents itself early on as being like, oh, these two are already clearly together, but it is not a good relationship because the guy, of the two guys, one of them is Isamu Dyson, who is like the main human protagonist and is like very much your maverick kind of character. But then the other guy in the love triangle is Gold Bowman, who is actually like a Zentradi descendant. Yeah. And because of the fact that the Zentradi were specifically engineered to be warfaring monsters, it's like those aggressive tendencies don't entirely go away, is all I'm going to say. I'm not especially fan of the characters and the relationship overall.
This was my first Macross, actually, but I haven't gone back to it in a long while. Like, I actually watched the movie a couple of years ago, and that movie did need to exist, by the way. Have you watched it yourself?
I've watched both the OVA and the movie for a comparison, and it is like the movie is very much like a like combining of those 4 episodes to try to fit the length of a movie. I know that like it did cut out like some key moments and whatnot from it.
Yeah, and I didn't love it as much as I did the first time.
And it's a shame too, because the YF-19 is literally my favorite Valkyrie design in all of Macross.
And it has Information High. Information High is a fucking banger. I love that song.
Yeah, some might say it's Sharon Apple's only good song. That's someone being me. It's a complicated thing. It's not all bad. Yeah. There's at least one Macross entry I can point to that I like even less than this. It is very much the sort of thing where like it fits in that category of anime that we boomers love to fillet, which is like anime that they deem to be prestigious from the 90s.
I will say, like, Macross Plus is still worth a watch if you're interested in it, because, like I said, it's way more Top Gun, and you're going to see lots of cool dogfights in it, and it's only 4 episodes. You can get through it really quickly.
It's at least a short one, and those dogfights are pretty great as well. Ichiro Itano was back for this anime, and you can tell. But following that, is Macross's true sequel and the turning point in defining what Macross is really all about. That if you were not on board, if you did not get what it was really about back in the 80s, this and everything after is not for you. Haters be gone. This is Macross 7, the official TV anime sequel, airing in October of 1994, which is like, it's funny to think, this actually started airing a couple months after the OVA of Macross Plus ended, by the way.
Wild.
A turning point where the musical emphasis was increased dramatically, and the focus was placed on a rock band rather than a pop idol. Firebomber, the legends themselves. Their music is used to combat spirit energy devouring beings called the Proto-Devlin, and they do this even while they're piloting VFs. So it sounds crazy, I know, but like that's an important thing to know, is that like to really get into Macross as a whole, you got to be willing to like be on the same wavelength as the series is, of just, these are dumb concepts and we're going to play them super straight.
And that's what the show does exactly, because this is pretty divisive.
In fact, recommending it from my perspective is divisive in a different way because of one major caveat.
Is it the pacing?
It is slow to get going.
Yeah, the pace. It is for like almost 49 episodes, and it should have been way less.
It should have been 26 at the most.
Because you feel that length.
You feel that length, but there's a clear point where once it starts going, once it stops spinning its wheels and moves forward, oh boy, it does not stop. Like the only thing that like could keep you going to that point is if you are immediately in love with Firebomber and its frontman Neki Basara, which we'll have a lot more to say about them when we talk more about Macross 7 in depth. But the short of it is like the recommendation is a yes with an asterisk. The asterisk being that, you know, it takes a long while to get to the stuff that really makes it legendary, but at the very least you'll still get to hear Firebomber's music constantly, and if you love it, you'll love it, and you'll even love the fact that they continue to put out new music even to this day. It also has an OVA sequel called Macross Dynamite 7, which has no pacing problems, but because it's a sequel, that does mean you can't just jump into it without first, you know, going through Macross 7 to begin with and, you know, getting familiar with the characters. But Dynamite 7's really good, especially because it's more original Firebomber music and it's like some of their best ever. Dynamite Explosion is an all-timer.
I'd say so, yeah.
Following that, this is now the other Macross entry that I was talking about that I rate even lower than plus. This is Macross 0, an OVA from 2002 in celebration of Macross's 20th anniversary. And might I say, what a pointless 20th anniversary celebration, because it's the only Macross entry that is a prequel.
What?
Yes, hence the name 0. Like, it takes place in 2008, 1 year before the events of Super Dimension Fortress Macross take place. It's supposed to be, like, kind of set amongst the backdrop of, like, the wars that humanity was going through in its quest to, like, try and unify everyone. You know, like, actually the formation of the UN Spacey proper.
Right.
But it has, like, the biggest case of unnecessary prequel syndrome, especially when it is the only prequel in the series in a franchise where every entry has been adamant about always going forward into the future. The only other thing I think can be said that's of note about 0 is that this was the first production that was handled by Kawamori's personally owned studio Satellite, and it's also highlighted by the fact that this was the first Macross anime where the mecha were done with like CG compositing on top of 2D animation.
No.
And like it's not nearly as rough as you would expect it to be compared to other anime that tried this from this time period, but you can tell it's still a long ways to go, both in terms of the frame timing and like the shading. It wouldn't be until the series that came after this where it started to become a lot more acceptable and like blend in better with the 2D animation. But regardless, like I would say even from this point on, it's like Kawamori and his studio are basically the only ones that are allowed to get away with like having CG animation for giant robots. I do kind of wish that it wasn't the case for every anime today.
Well, at least they look way better now than they used to.
They do. Techniques have improved a lot in that regard, but you could still know that there is a difference between when something is properly hand-drawn and like animated on those particular frames.
Yeah.
Also, 0 technically introduces like a character that ends up being like the ancestors to like a very important character in our next entry, Macross Frontier. Put simply, if the original Super Dimension Fortress Macross is like a big deal in terms of being the progenitor of this entire franchise, in Japan alone, I think Frontier might still be the reigning champion of most popular Macross entry ever, because this was a TV anime from 2007 in celebration of Macross's 25th anniversary, and it was a big fucking deal over there.
It's such a big show. We cannot emphasize enough how big it.
Words hard.
Words are hard sometimes, y'all.
Yeah, like there's a lot of stuff that is in it that basically highlights the fact that it's an anniversary celebration. Like a lot of like character designs and traits and like other visual motifs that are like kind of like calling back all the way to the original Super Dimension Fortress Macross. They bring back the idea of like J-pop idol being like at the center of like the music, to the point where it's not just one, but two pop idols this time. This was the series that introduced the world to the galactic fairy known as Cheryl Gnome, as well as up-and-coming idol that is like credited as the next Minmay, Ranka Lee. And much like with Minmay herself, like both of these characters, like they're actresses, like the characters that they did songs for basically prop up like their careers and push them forward. Ranka Lee's actress in particular, Megumi Nakajima especially, benefited from it the most because like I think like she was like even more fresh-faced compared to Cheryl Gnome's singing voice, which I should preface as far as this, like obviously Minmay and Ranka Lee both have like their voice actor is also the same person that does all the singing, like but Cheryl Gnome's a bit different in that like she actually has both a regular voice actress as well as a separate like singer for her singing voice, just because Mayan, I believe her name is, like was obviously a bit more trained in this regard already. Neki Basra in Macross 7 from Man for Fire Bomber is also the same way. Yoshiki Fukuyama is his name, which very prominent member in Jam Project. If you've listened to a lot of their songs, his voice becomes very distinct.
You'll definitely recognize it if you listen to enough Jam Project.
But Frontier's good. I do think it's good in the way where it's like, it's not an all-time favorite, the TV anime at least, particularly because of its adherence to being so celebratory of Macross's like entire history, that I think some of its new ideas do not get the room to fully flourish the way that it could. But it is still, I think, worth a watch, especially just to understand if you've seen Japanese memes and other stuff from like around this time and beyond, and wanting to know like what the cultural significance is of Frontier specifically. It's good to give it a watch all the same. What I do like more than Frontier, the TV anime, is Macross Frontier, the movies, The False Songstress and Wings of Farewell, a duology from 2009 to 2011. This one is actually much closer, at least at the start, to being like a compilation film series, much like Gundam had, as well as several other anime since then. But the first film is especially like a compilation film, while the second film is predominantly new animation, and its plot goes in a very different direction, such that like I actually like it contributes a lot to it being like my preferred version of the Macross Frontier story. And it's so good that this is actually going to be one of our episodes later in the future, because these films, they are just that good. And because they are films, that means you can get through them in an afternoon, and it is absolutely worth a watch. You'll feel all sorts of emotions.
It'll be my first time watching these films, so I'm excited to see what they're about.
I cannot wait for what words you have to say about Wings of Farewell, because I know there's a point where like shit is going to get absolutely crazy, and you will love it for that.
Oh, that's getting me hyped. I'm already excited. I'm even more excited.
Yeah. Interesting thing about these movies as well, because of the time they came out in. When these first came out on Blu-ray, this was during the PS3 generation. You know, obviously, like the one console of that lineup between the 360 and the Wii that could actually play Blu-rays. As an interesting thing that was done with the Blu-ray releases for the Macross Frontier movies is that they were released as hybrid packs, which if you put them into a PS3, you could, you know, go to the videos tab of like the XMB and, you know, load it from there as a film. Or you could go over to the game tab when the disc was in and load up a small playable game by the developers of the Macross PSP games, because again, Frontier was so huge that like there was a huge boost in all kinds of Macross merchandise, including video games. So you actually get to have like short missions in the style of what you'd get in those PSP games, which are fairly bare bones, but a really solid gameplay model that is a lot of fun. And you basically get to play through, you know, major scenarios from the movie itself. They even have like a picture-in-picture kind of setup where like kind of in the corner you get to see footage from the film itself as it pertains to the battle you're fighting in.
That's really cool. I never knew about this.
It's really cool, and it is such a shame that is a concept that could only have ever existed on PS3, because with our ever increasing march towards the digital future, it's like you no longer get to have that kind of gimmick as a thing.
Oh, that's the advantage of having like physical media like that sometimes.
Physical media combined with consoles that are able to get away with more esoteric functions and be more than just like a weaker PC with a closed off UI.
Yeah.
That said, though, speaking of hybrid packs, do you remember Love also got the hybrid pack treatment because it had a Blu-ray release to commemorate Macross's 30th anniversary. So to close this out, there's one more Macross series that obviously needs to be covered, and that is Delta. The TV anime from 2016. We've had all kinds of music acts up to this point. You know, Lin Min Mei, Sharon Apple, Fire Bomber, Cheryl Nome, Ronka Lee. This time, we have the tactical sound unit Valkyrie, which combats a spaceborne illness using music in cooperation with Delta Flight, belonging to the mercenary company Chaos. And tactical sound units, they're basically Fire Bomber 2.0.
Nice.
They are literally playing music in battle. And this is all amid a story that ultimately like unravels to like being a war between the new UN Spacey and another descendant of the protoculture called the Kingdom of Windermere. So you basically get a plot that, compared to others in Macross by this point, this one feels the most like something you'd expect out of Gundam, actually, because it's no longer a war between two sides that are like so completely different that like there has to be some sort of bridging of culture by introducing things they've never heard of. In this case, it's like, no, both sides know what song are. They're just both using songs in different ways. Because Windermere's got a beef with the new UN Spacey for reasons that are very clearly informed by Kawamori and members of the staff not liking the idea of America being the big military empire that it is. It's really good, though. I've heard some things from like people that seem to make it appear that they don't like it, but I assume they've not watched it in full. Especially because if you watch its first episode, I think that's the ultimate litmus test of like if you are a Macross faithful or not. Because there's obviously some sacrifices we had to make as far as our list. Mm-hmm. I know for you, Neff, like Turn A Gundam does not get a specific episode for us to talk about because there's just not the time to watch it. Similarly, I've had to give up Macross Delta in this instance because it is my favorite Macross series, bar none. The TV anime is a delight to me personally.
This is a show that has passed by me somehow. Like, I didn't even know it was a thing until you mentioned it.
It passed by a lot of people, which is still so surprising, but I guess that kind of makes it obvious how much like Frontier was just kind of saturated everywhere, that even now you still occasionally get some things from like the Frontier side of the franchise coming out, like a new song by Ronka Lee or something like that. But like Delta just does so many things that I find like really good. And like, again, getting back to kind of what I liked about the Frontier movies in that like it's not needing to trade so much on like reminding you of its legacy and still finding new ways to kind of like push familiar concepts forward in other ways. The love triangle's a bit too one-sided, I'm going to say, but I don't mind because the pairing between Freya and Hayate is just so perfect. Freya is adorable. She's a wonderful fucking space country bumpkin. I love her. If anything happened to Freya, I would kill everyone in this room and then myself. Oh wait, no one is in this room. That's a relief.
Well, I'm the only one in this room, or in this call at least.
Well, virtual.
Yes.
I can't reach you, so you're safe. Delta is like an emphatic recommendation for me. The Delta movies, there, however, they're also worth recommending, but I can't say that I like that version of the story overall more than the TV anime. Much like Frontier, it did get the same treatment of, you know, two films. The first one predominantly being like, you know, like a compilation film. Although even more so because the first film, I'm just going to say, it basically ends with like concluding the same plot that the entire TV anime did, whereas the first Frontier movie, it clearly ends in a spot that already lets you know that it has diverged a lot from Frontier, the TV anime. Passionate Valkyrie, the first Delta movie, meanwhile, is like so much of a compilation retelling that it feels almost pointless. There's like some key story changes that kind of show up that you need to know about, particularly when it comes to the sequel, Absolute Live with 6 exclamation marks, because they had to like put so much passion into it, because that one is all original animation. It continues the story. It introduces new music, including tracks by an evil AI version of Valkyrie known as Yamikure.
That's incredible.
They only get 3 songs, and god damn it, do I wish that they had like an entire album's worth of music that is just evil as fuck Valkyrie music. Because just look up, anyone that is curious, like just search like Macross Delta and then the song Diva in Abyss. Fucking banger. It is the kind of song that like I could see myself like rocking to as I'm trying to storm Dracula's castle or something. Like it sounds something that would fit a classic Vania.
I just love the idea of an evil AI song, like band.
Especially because it makes better good on the idea that they started with Sharon Apple in Macross Plus, who was like a virtual idol, and as part of the plot in that, like she gets like installed with like an AI chip that was like very illegally produced and causes her to go crazy and use her music to brainwash people. So the Delta movies, especially with Yamikure, and even the TV anime, what with Kingdom of Windermere having a song of its own, that very much deals with the idea of like how music itself can be weaponized. And I love how Yamikure is just the ultimate realization of that weaponization, that you just create an evil doppelganger clone of your main sound unit.
I can't believe it took this long for them to make a concept like that. It feels like something that would have happened sooner.
Those are the major Macross entries. I think it's pretty clear from my enthusiasm and how I've talked about it which ones are obvious recommendations, which ones to avoid. Absolutely worth watching. It is definitely, I would say, overall compared to something like Gundam, obviously a higher track record and quality. But I think that goes without saying. It's because they are not trying to churn out as much content every year. It's able to avoid what I've always felt is like Gundam's curse as a result of its popularity, in that, you know, it has continued to endure so long past the involvement of its original creators that anyone can work on a Gundam, and that means like anyone can bring their own wild ideas to it for good or for ill, and you never know quite exactly what you're going to get. Macross, meanwhile, there's enough of a consistency and the constant kind of mandate of like, at least so far, aside from the one example, to always push forward in the timeline. So you never really feel like it's needing to go back and explore something that was like not necessary to be explored. It's great. I cannot recommend it enough.
You can definitely there's definitely more winners from the sound of it, and you're probably okay watching most of this, except for like Zero. Don't watch Zero. Yeah,
Zero is just way too forgettable to really be enjoyable. Plus is kind of a curiosity. Everything else, and even then, from 7 onwards, the important thing to note, kind of as we talked about, is like, yeah, you have to be firmly in the camp of being a believer of the power of music. Yeah. If you are not on board with that and like the kind of music that the Macross series is willing to produce, you're not going to have a good time, especially with Frontier and Delta's emphasis on like these on J-pop idols. But even then, it's still J-pop that I would prefer to listen to more compared to like other commercially produced J-pop, because at least the music is designed to fit within like the context of like heated space battles.
Yeah, you're still going to get lots of dogfights in these shows. It's also you're just going to get a lot of J-pop music.
Never let anyone try and convince you otherwise that the mecha become more and more de-emphasized as the series go on. That is a complete fucking lie. Delta introduces the Kingdom of Windermere's like transforming mecha, and they have like a fucking money shot the first time they show it transform to let you know that its mechanism is not like the Valkyries.
Oh yes, that rules.
Like, as long as Kawamori is still around as, like, the chief director and supervisor for this shit, as well as mecha designer, it is still going to be what it has always been.
Yeah, and maybe we'll get a new Macross in the future, but who could say? It is definitely... We
definitely are. I could definitely say as much. There was news a while back that that a new Macross anime has entered production, and it's in collaboration with Sunrise.
Oh, wow. Okay, that I didn't see coming.
Which is a surprise considering how Satellite has basically been like in charge of like the main production ever since Zero. So this is kind of a big shift. I imagine it's still going to be CG at the end of the day, just because I know it's like, but at the same time, because Sunrise has had a lot of animators over there that like wants to do really good animation of robots, that I think there's still like some contingent of animators over there that know how to do 2D animation for robots. Like they're one of the last holdouts. I don't know if that means that they're possibly going to work on this new Macross. I think that would be pretty funny and ironic if like, with the industry now moving to like CG animation for like all non-humanoid objects, including robots, that Sunrise comes in and be like, oh yeah, here's a Macross anime where everything's 2D animated. I would fucking love that shit.
I would hope so. I would love a new 2D like Macross again.
You know what I also love in a new Macross? Have like a new music act that is actually a guy. Have like a boy J-pop idol or something. Why not?
I say it's the
we need more guys in this lineup. It feels awkward looking at like all of like the music acts across the Macross series, and how the one that sticks out like a sore thumb out of all these is Neki Basara from Firebomb.
You're right. We need a new one that's all about a boy band. Make it just the pretty boys of Macross.
Just have the general inverse of how like the love triangle typically is, where it's the Valkyrie pilot that is a girl, and that is the pop idol that is a boy.
Yes, make Otome Macross.
Otome Macross. Let's fucking go.
Holy shit. I want to know Otome Macross. That sounds awesome.
No idea if that will actually be the case,
not.
but regardless, with how much of Macross I've seen up to this point and being all up to date on Delta and everything, even down to like, you know, getting a hold of like the albums of like their concert live recordings of various songs, I may be a bit of a fan if you couldn't tell. But whatever form this new Macross anime is going to take, I'm going to be on board for minute one. Or at least like I'll be on board to watch it as soon as like I can guarantee that like it will be. This will actually be the best test, I think, for the current era we are in, where Harmony Gold is no longer cock blocking new Macross entries, to see is like how far will distribution of the new Macross anime go? Yeah, you know, is it just going to be dumped on Disney Plus again to like a little fanfare, or are they actually going to? Like, is Crunchyroll actually going to like make a move on it or something to actually get it on more platforms or not? I don't know. I may still fall back on waiting for like fan translators to kind of put things together, especially if it includes like song lyrics, because I think that's an important part. Yeah. But I say future is bright.
Yeah, it's not over for Macross, thankfully.
Yeah, as long as Kawamori draws breath. This was a fun deep dive into Macross. Yeah. I sincerely hope that we have spread wondrous Deculture to all of you at home. Do give these a look sometime if you have Disney Plus and are willing to go through that as like a legitimate channel, or if you have no problem sailing the high seas, you know, getting like old fan sub copies. It like many of these entries are worth a watch. It is a fantastic saga. Dare I say, I like it more as a saga compared to something like Universal Century Gundam. But that's just because of how much I've prioritized certain anime that I've watched over the years.
It's definitely up to taste, but Macross is still a really good series. It and Gundam are both fantastic, and I guess it depends on what kind of vibe you want from your shows, but you can never go wrong with any of them.
Macross on the whole, you'll definitely be getting like a good, positive, feel-good vibe if you let the music into your soul.
Yeah, which is unlike Zeta Gundam, which will crush your soul by the end of it.
That was fun. Thanks for being on here, Neff.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks again, everyone at home, for listening. And tune in next time for the final of our 4 big overview episodes, where we talk about mecha anime that is all about courage.
Yeah, we'll catch you all later for that one. Bye.